pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, so it is February 25th PM work session, Andrews County Road Commission. If the clerk would call the roll, please.
Newman?
Here.
Underwood?
Here.
Brown?
Here.
Gilman?
Here.
Mauser?
Here. So we have an agenda. It's fairly straightforward. One item. Do we have a motion for approval of agenda?
Support.
Have motion and support. Any discussion? Hearing none, I guess we have to do the roll call every time. Is that the case with Zoomies? Okay.
Underwood?
Yes.
Brown?
Yes.
Gilman?
Yes.
Lehman?
Yes.
Mauser?
Yes. Is there anyone who would care to express conflict of interest at this time? Hearing none, we'll take that as a no comment. Public comment. Clerk would read rules of public comment and the appropriate time lapse and all that.
Any person may make an advanced appointment with the board regarding road commission topics for a regular or special meeting in accordance with the Open Meetings Act. If an appointment is made, the topic will be an agenda item. The following applies to public comment. Please state his or her name and address. Topic must be relevant to the road commission. Individuals are allowed to speak once for up to 3 minutes on a single topic, which may be extended by the chair. A group addressing the board requires a designated spokesperson who may speak up to 10 minutes. The board will not act on any item from the public that is not on the agenda. For remote access users, if you wish to participate in public comment, please raise your hand via Zoom. For call-ins, we can unmute you. If you wish to speak, say yes.
Okay, do we have anybody online who has requested or?
The only attendee we have is Wayne.
Oh.
So
Okay.
we're pretty much okay.
Hopefully we won't be hearing from him for a little while. Okay, so do we have to give it a 30-second
I think we're good.
delay?
Nobody
Or
on.
since we have nobody on, we can move right on. Okay. The work session topics. I guess we schedule this meeting to discuss property acquisitions because I think it's going to become kind of a big deal here in the near future. And I don't know if any of us have got a whole lot of working knowledge on the whole thing. We went through it a little bit with the roundabout there at Keystone and Cass. But with the East-West issue coming up, and several years ago, 3 years ago, we was talking about Airport Road expansion that might be necessary there, widening. That would require possibly some property acquisitions or right-of-ways. And then other areas with these roundabouts that are planned. So it seemed like a good idea maybe to get a heads up on this and talk about or get some information from our council as far as what the basic ins and outs. And then I guess I'd like to have a little conversation after that where we can all kind of, we all like to look outside the box, play what ifs a little bit maybe. And if we can, look at those kind of things and see what are legitimate things to talk about, and then how do we approach it? If say there was a large parcel we needed to acquire, how would we do that? Would we just call them up on the phone, or would we have our council do it, or would a small ad hoc committee of some sort? I guess how we would even approach that. So I guess with that, we'll turn it over to Carrie, our counsel, and hear what she has to say.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me.
Yep.
Okay, good. So I have a PowerPoint just to kind of guide us through this. So I'm going to try to share my screen. And if it gets, I'm not really great at sharing my screen. So if it gets a little complicated, then maybe I can just send it to, oh wait, no, this is not working. Maybe I can just send it to.
I got it, Carrie. I'll forward it to Larry.
Oh yeah, okay, thank you. I just think that might be a little bit easier. Although, well, I'll follow along on my PowerPoint. Okay. So, oops. tell me when you guys are looking at the PowerPoint. So while we're getting it up, so what the PowerPoint is really kind of a high level overview of property acquisition in connection with projects, road commission projects. Oh, there we go.
Just make it a full screen so you can see
Wow,
it.
there he is, very technologically savvy there. So it's a high level overview of property acquisition in connection with road commission projects or projects for a public purpose, for building roads, maintaining roads, repairing roads, and or building road commission facilities. And then I know that Chair Mauser, when he contacted me, he had, you know, some specific questions about specific kind of thinking outside of the box and thoughts about, can we do that? And questions about, can we do that? So I thought after we do go through the high level overview, we can go to those specific questions, if that works out for everyone. So if we could move to the first slide. Yes, there we go. So preliminary considerations in considering property acquisitions are, first of all, identify the property that we're talking about, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Identify what is the project. Is the project just your simple standard run-of-the-mill road construction and repair with using millage funds, or is it something more, I don't know, I don't want to say more significant, but something more significant in the sense that we're getting funds through either a federal grant or a state grant, or we're getting funds through the Federal Transportation Administration. It's very important in considering what you can do to identify what is the project and what are the sources. And then the third thing is to identify the source of funding, because a lot of times the source of funding will dictate at least the process that has to be utilized in order to acquire the property, and or dictate what you have to pay in order to acquire the property. And then the final thought to think about is, what is the interest needed? So we'll go through, if we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, are you guys on the next slide? Sorry. Okay, good. All right, so in identifying the property, there, you know, types, you have to identify the types of property: commercial, residential, agricultural, other. And the reason why that is important is if we're in a more formal acquisition process, because we're receiving federal funds or state dollars that are governed by the state administrative rules and the federal regulations with respect to acquisition of property, whether you're acquiring a piece of residential property or a commercial property or an agricultural property, dictates like what other costs in addition to the price that you have to pay for the property that have to be paid in connection with the project. For example, the residential properties, if it's a residential property, if it's a principal residence, you have to pay 125% of the fair market value. There are relocation costs to be considered, as well as moving costs to be considered. If it's a commercial piece of property, you have to think about relocation costs as well as moving costs. And then also in both situations, it's important to identify the occupancy of the property. Is it occupied by a tenant or is it occupied by an owner? If it's an owner occupied, it's a little bit more straightforward in the acquisition process. If it's tenant occupied, it becomes a little bit more complex, because not only especially if you're in the formal acquisition process, not only do you have to approach and negotiate with the owner, you in a tenant occupied situation, sometimes depending on the process where you can negotiate and come to a settlement in the process, you might have to approach and negotiate with the tenant as well. And then you have to consider relocation costs for the tenants. So if, for example, if it's a commercial multi-tenant piece of property, then you could be having to deal with relocation costs times however many tenants are in that particular piece of property. So it's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about property acquisition, is what type of property and who is occupying that property, because that's going to dictate, the cost, or a rough dictate the budgeting for the acquisition of that particular piece of property. Next slide, please. So then the next issue to identify is, what is the project? If it's an existing road maintenance or repair project, new road construction or facility construction. Identifying the project is important for several reasons, because one reason being, usually when you identify what project we're talking about, it also dictates or leads to the answer to the next question, which is, what is the source of funding? It's also important in connection with and thinking about what is the type of property, or what is the interest that needs to be acquired from the particular owner in the particular situation. Existing road maintenance and repair, we have historically on occasion in connection with our general road millage projects or road construction and repair maintenance projects, we've had to negotiate with property owners for the acquisition of an easement, for example, or a license to either grade or to install drainage ditches or other drainage functions outside of the road right away in order to make the road function properly. So that's a typical example of some property acquisition that would occur in a road maintenance or construction situation. A new road is obviously a different animal in that situation. If you're putting through a new road in a new road right away, that is obviously a bigger acquisition project than your standard existing road maintenance or repair acquisition. And then a facility construction, it's unlikely, but it's possible that the road commission may need to sometime in the future construct another facility, another maintenance facility or something like that. I mean, usually when you're thinking about facility construction, you would go out on the market to see if there's anything in the particular location that would fit your needs to construct a facility before you would move to acquisition through condemnation, for example. But if you're going to do facility, so that would be an important consideration in knowing what project you're going to do, because you would, in that situation, know that there's probably likely several properties out there, perhaps already on the market, that would work for your needs, and it would be more of a normal. When I say normal, it would be less of a condemnation action or a acquiring property for somebody that doesn't necessarily want to give you the property. It'd be more of a normal seller buyer transaction in those kind of situations. Next slide, please. So identify source of funding. That's very important because if we're just using our millage funds or Act 51 funds, I know Act 51 has its rules, but if we're just using those types of funds, we have a lot more flexibility in using those types of funds and how we approach property owners for negotiating the purchase of a property interest from them, because we're not restricted by the guidelines in the federal regulations and the state regulations with respect to acquisitions of property that we would be restricted to if we were using federal funds or state or federal grant funds. those guidelines and those regulations, especially in a situation where you're acquiring property for a project, are good kind of touchstones that you can utilize in considering acquiring property when you're using these other funds where you have more flexibility. They're good guidelines, but what's nice when you have more flexibility is you don't have to follow them to the T. They just provide you with guidance in the situation instead of actually having to follow them to the T. Next slide, please. And then the next thing to think about is what is the interest needed for the particular project. And this is very important because obviously the interest, to identify the interest needed is, obviously would affect what is the price you're going to pay for the particular property that you want to acquire. And then, so that it'll affect that, of course. It'll also affect if you have to, if it's a project that will require ultimately condemnation, you will want to make sure that you've really identified the interest that you need, because one of the issues that will come up in condemnation is whether is then a necessity challenge. So a necessity challenge in condemnation is where the property owner challenges whether you need the property for a particular public purpose. Public purpose is usually no problem, but where a property owner could challenge you is whether the interest that you're seeking to acquire is actually needed for that public purpose. So it's very important to really dial in on that. And then another reason why it's very important to dial in on the interest needed is because especially if it's being funded with federal funds or grant funds, because the funding source will probably make you demonstrate as well that that is an interest that you need for the project that they are funding with their dollars. So typically speaking, they won't fund the acquisition of a property interest that's not needed for the project. So if, for example, if all you need is an easement, but we're saying, oh, well, but we'd like to purchase the entire piece of property, for a particular reason, but all you need is an easement for the project, the funding source may push back on reimbursing you for that, for acquiring the full piece of property. It's not necessarily you can't acquire the full piece of property. The funding source might push back. And then ultimately, if you only need an easement, but you want to do full acquisition and the property owner is not willing to do that, you're going to perhaps have an issue when you go to condemnation on the issue of necessity. So in thinking about the interest you need and for the project, what is the project? What are we building? Is it an entire road? Where is this road going, for example? And what's the route of the road and how is it impacting this particular piece of property? If the impact to the particular piece of property is really great and really high in the sense that it would leave it with no economic, viable use, or in the case of that property that you guys acquired for the roundabout, I think that I wasn't involved in that acquisition, but I'm certain you acquired the entire piece of property probably because that the roundabout was going to leave this property basically like useless for its purpose as a residential piece of property. Or, is it something where you can do a partial acquisition? So it's like a 40-acre piece of property and you're just running, over the corner of that 40-acre piece of property. Can you just take the fee of that portion, or can you just get an easement, a right-of-way easement over that particular portion? The difference between the acquisitions being basically how much you're going to pay, or do you just need a license? Lots of times when we do grading, for maintenance and repair of road construction, we just get licenses. So we can go out and just grade. And then once we grade, we're done. So, and a license is, you know, a lot cheaper, and it's really basically just an agreement that you can go and do this for a particular period of time, and then you move on. So that's obviously the cheapest and the simplest of the acquisitions, all the way to a full acquisition. So the next slide is negotiation. So after you've thought about all these things and done your background work, you know, you're starting to think about negotiating with a property owner. And there are two types of negotiations. Like, I mean, there are, you know, many types, but for purposes of simplifying things, we'll talk about the, you know, two types of negotiations. There's negotiations for voluntary acquisitions, and then there's negotiations in connection with project-based acquisitions. And what I mean by that is project-based acquisitions, so acquisitions that are necessary, that you need to acquire for the project. And when a project arises and it becomes necessary for you to acquire that for the project, especially if you're receiving funds from grants or the federal funds or state funds, then you're going to have to, it's going to be a different sort of negotiation, and it's going to be a more formalized negotiation that's going to be required than in the voluntary acquisition situation, which is where the property is not necessarily needed for a project right now, or not necessarily needed for the project. So to go back to my example of, if you were going to build a road, a new road, and there's a 48-acre piece of parcel, and it's going over one corner of the parcel. And so all you really need is an easement for the parcel, and taking an easement for the parcel wouldn't necessarily affect the rest of the value or the reasonable use of the parcel. You don't need to acquire the entire parcel, but maybe there's a reason why the road commission wants to acquire the entire parcel that's not necessarily related to the project. I mean, that's related to the project, that's not necessarily needed for the project. Then in that case, it would kind of be out of the project-based acquisition negotiation. It would be more of a voluntary negotiation acquisition type of situation. And one of the very big keys to a voluntary acquisition is that the road commission can choose not to purchase. And a voluntary acquisition can be more flexible. So you can think outside the box a little bit more in a voluntary acquisition situation, because you're not like pigeonholed into this process that you are pigeonholed into in a project-based acquisition. As I said earlier, you can look to the guidelines and the guidances for the project-based acquisitions or the non-voluntary acquisitions to provide you guidance in helping you determine, you know, what kind of things can be offered to the particular property owner, but you don't have to. So that's kind of nice in a voluntary acquisition situation. But sometimes you can't go to a voluntary acquisition because you need it for the project. And if you need it for the project, then it's very important, as I said, you need to make that determination that you need the particular property interest that you are acquiring from this particular owner for this project. It's very important if you have to go to condemnation, for example. It is less flexible because you do have to follow the guidelines and the regulations that are promulgated by the state and the Federal Transportation Administration for acquiring property, which is, you know, I mean, it's very extensive, and we won't go into them here, and but they are extensive. So it is a less flexible process. And then once you acquire property, we'll talk about it a little later, but once you acquire property through these federal fundings or other funding sources, disposing of the property then, you know, comes under their regulations too. Whereas when you voluntarily voluntarily acquire property using your own funds, it doesn't have as many strings attached. So if we can go to the next slide, please, which should be establishing value. So before you go into negotiations for acquiring a piece of property, it would be a good idea to establish the value of the property you're acquiring and the interest you're acquiring on the property. When we're in this more informal world, like when we're on the fly, which we've done before, where we've had to acquire an easement, for example, for a drainage ditch, or an easement for a grading easement, or an easement to place a stop sign, for example, outside of the existing road right away. I mean, obviously you're doing that on the fly and you don't have time to go through this more formalized process to establish value before you sit down with the property owner. It's sort of done on the fly. But if you are acquiring property in connection with this more formal process, where you're subject to these rules and regulations, before you sit down with the property owner, you definitely have to establish the value of the interest that you're acquiring. Otherwise they won't reimburse you for the cost of that acquisition. So how we establish value is we have the formal method of establishing value, and then we have less formal methods. The formal method of establishing value is through an appraisal process, using an appraiser looking at the value of the property. In a fee simple acquisition, it's a relatively straightforward analysis. When it becomes a little bit more complicated is when you're just acquiring an easement, or you're just acquiring a portion of the piece of the property, that the analysis of the value of what is being taken and or attempted to be purchased becomes a little bit more complex and complicated. But it can be done. And many times it's worth really thinking about, do we need the full fee of this particular property, or can we just do an easement? Because if we can just do an easement, lots of times it'll save us money in the end on the project. But regardless of the nature of the negotiations, whether we do a more formal method of an appraisal or a less formal method, which I didn't touch on, a less formal method is a method that some reasonable method of establishing value. We've done it before in connection with the acquisition of an easement. We've taken a look at the tax assessment records and what a particular piece of property is assessed at, the true cash value, and then kind of come up with a vacant, a rough back of the napkin vacant land value, and then apply that to the square footage that we need. And then we come up with a rough estimate of, this is a reasonable value to pay for an easement, for example. But you can't do that. You can only do that in very limited circumstances, and usually only when we're utilizing just the road commission's funds, not necessarily the state or the federal funds, because the state and feds want to see a much more formal method of establishing value. But regardless of the nature of how you're going to establish value, the road commission should not pay more than the fair market value of the property for the property being acquired. If you pay more, and when I say that, that sounds like a black line or a bright line rule, and it is a bright line rule, except for the beauty of the value of property is that it is not a bright line rule. Typically, you ask an appraiser, you can ask 3 appraisers the value of something, and you'll get, probably different answers from 3 appraisers. It'll be in a range, but you'll probably get 3 different answers from 3 different appraisers. So even though it's a bright line rule that we should not pay more than fair market value, what is fair market value is not always necessarily a bright line rule. So keep that in mind when you're negotiating. Next slide, please. So other compensation considerations that have to be taken into account is if we are acquiring the entire fee or a portion of the fee that affects the occupancy of the owner or tenants, then we have to consider relocation costs that have to be offered to and paid to the owner and or the tenants of the property, the occupants of the property. We have to consider moving costs, and if it's a principal residence, we have to consider that we're probably going to be paying about 125% of the fair market value, which I know I just violates that bright line rule I just gave you, but it is it's either in the Uniform Condemnation Procedures Act that you pay the 125%, or it's in one of the regulations. So that's an exception to the bright line rule I just gave you. Next slide, please. So meeting with the owner, how to meet with the owner. You know, this is like I mean, it all depends. It all depends. It's a case by case situation, depending on, especially in a voluntary acquisition situation. There's really no set formula for meeting with the owner for a voluntary acquisition. You know, it can be as informal as contacting the owner and saying, hey, you know, we need an easement over your property. Are you agreeable to it? And if the owner is agreeable, then we say, great, we'll send you the easement document, and that's it. And then all the way through, if it's a project-based acquisition where you have to follow all these rules, then you have to do it in a more formalized way where you sit down with the property owner. Ideally, you can present it to them in written form, but ideally you sit down with the property owner and you present to them. Well, first of all, before you meet with them to do the presentation of the good faith offer, especially if it's in connection with a large project, like a new road that, you know, runs through like land that has never had a road run through it before. Before you meet with them on this stage of presenting the good faith offer, it's a good idea to have an informational meeting with the property owners, with all of the property owners affected before going into this formal process. And that informational meeting can be like a group meeting where you invite everyone to come and look at the project, and this is what we're doing, and this is the plan, and this is how we're intending to approach you about acquiring your piece of property. This is, you know, the things that you're going to be entitled to if we have to acquire your piece of property, and just give them all the information that we possibly can at that particular time about that project, so they are aware, they are involved in the process before you just call them up one day and say, hey, we've got this good faith offer that we want to present to you because we need your property. That doesn't typically work very well with property owners. They don't really like that. They like to be involved in the process, and they like to know what's coming at least. I mean, does not necessarily mean it's going to be easier to acquire the property from them, but it certainly will provide them with that opportunity to know what's coming, get to know the project, get to know why the road commission is contacting them, asking them to acquire their particular piece of property, and then they can, do their own research to see, what they're entitled to, etc. And you can provide them with all that information so they're aware of it. So after that initial meeting, that initial kickoff meeting, then you can sit down and you could have a one-on-one initial meeting with the property owners to really just kind of give them a nice general overview, like one-on-one. This is this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing what we're doing. These are the steps that we're going to take in order to, you know, try to come to reach an agreement with you with respect to acquiring your property. And then, you know, let them know you're going to have an appraisal done on their particular piece of property, and you know that will be the initial offer. You know, depending on the interest acquired, if it's, you know, their principal residence you're acquiring, the full fee, it'll be 125%. But if it's an easement, for example, it'll be based on the value of that easement. You know, really just try to give them all the information that you possibly can, especially if it's, you know, in connection with like a big project, big new project. It's very important to give them all that information before you sit down with them and do the formal presentation of the good faith offer. So after you've had all that information, and then at that, you know, when you're doing those initial meetings, then you decide, you know, who should, it really should be the person that meets with them on the initial like one-on-one meeting should be the person that's going to be negotiating, the person or persons that are going to be negotiating with the property owners on a go-forward basis. I think it always works well if the engineer for the project or the project, the person that is in charge of the project from a engineering or design perspective be one of the persons that meet with the property owner, because that person has all that information about what, where, why, what are we doing, you know, where are we going. And then, you know, the negotiator, the other negotiator, there should always be two people, because you should always have, you know, two people, so one person can take notes and the other person can do the talking. And also it's always good just to have, you know, two people at the table so they can corroborate each other's, you know, what was said and what wasn't said during the negotiation. And then the second negotiator, it shouldn't be necessarily like, it shouldn't be the manager or a member of the board, because ultimately, you know, they're the decision maker. And so it's easier if the negotiator is not the person that can make the decision, but the person that can say to the property owner, you know, when the negotiations get hot and heavy, well, that's something that I can, you know, take back to the road commission manager or the board to see if they're up to that, especially in our situation, because usually we have to have the board's approval anyways. So we might as well not have somebody that, you know, appears to be a decision maker negotiating with the property owner. So once you present the good faith offer, you sit down with the property owner and you go through the appraisal with the property owner, letting him know this is the value that came up that the appraiser determined, and this is the value we're offering you under the good faith offer, which may or may not include relocation costs, moving costs, etc., depending on what the acquisition is. Then you explain to them that, you know, this is based on your appraisal, you know, our appraisal, the road commission's appraisal. If they have, you know, if they establish a different value, you know, through a legitimate process, then that's something we can take a look at in considering considering the amount that's being offered. And it's very important at this point, because at this good faith offer stage, you've sort of you have initiated the procedures under the Uniform Condemnation Procedures Act for acquiring property. But it's, which can be, if you don't come to an agreement and you need the property, which you shouldn't be in the Uniform Condemnation Procedures Act process unless you actually need the property. Once you start the process, you can't easily back out, because there's some provisions in the Condemnation Procedures Act that if you start trying to acquire the property and then back out, then you have to pay some costs and fees depending on the stage in which you, in the stage in which you are under the Uniform Condemnation Procedures Act. So you're presenting the good faith offer, but you explain to them, you know, that you know, it's not the road commission's desire that, you know, we have to go to condemnation here. We don't want to go to court. We want to negotiate this, you know, obviously within the realm and the bounds within which the road commission, you know, has to operate, but we want to negotiate a resolution with the property owner, and that's definitely our preferred method. And we don't want to have to go to condemnation. So because ultimately, if you don't reach an agreement, then, you know, you go to circuit court to acquire the particular property through a condemnation proceeding that involves, if you could go to the next slide, please. That is a whole process that's set forth in the Condemnation Act, but just kind of an overview of it. It involves a declaration of necessity from the Road Commission to declare that you need it for the particular public purpose, the project. You deposit the funds that the appraisal developed as the fair market value for the purchase of the property with the court or an escrow agent. And then you file a complaint against the property owner for acquisition of the property. And then the issues to be decided by the court in the condemnation proceeding are really just two issues. Necessity is the first issue. The property owner can challenge necessity. So this kind of goes back to the original discussion, my discussion about how it's very important when identifying what is the property, what is the project, and what is necessary for the project, and what do you need from this property? Because if you're going for anything more than you need, you could have a problem at the necessity challenge. And then as long as you get past the necessity challenge, then the only issue left on the table is what is the amount that's going to be paid for that particular property that you're trying to acquire. And in that process, that issue seems simple and straightforward, but it becomes very complex when you get to a court proceeding, because as I alluded to, you know, the issue of fair market value, although it seems like a very bright line rule, the issue of fair market value becomes less of a bright line rule very, very quickly, depending on your appraiser and depending on who's looking at the issue. So it just becomes messy, and condemnation becomes messy, and it's definitely something that, you know, public entities, to the extent they can, they should avoid having to go to condemnation. But of course, sometimes you have to go to condemnation to acquire a particular piece of property. It's just the way it is. If you need it and the property owner will not sell it to you, you do have to go to condemnation. But what you try to do is along the way is, you know, get to a situation where the property owner feels like they are being treated fairly in this process, and they're, you know, don't want to go through the condemnation process. But it's not always successful. So that's kind of a high overview of the process of acquiring public property for private property for a public use. Hopefully, does anyone have any questions? And I know that there were some specific scenarios I think you guys wanted to talk through. I'd be happy to answer any questions and like kind of brainstorm with you guys on particular questions or concerns you might have.
Lights are back up. Okay, I guess full lights are private. Let's take it first. I guess, does anybody have a specific question on what Carrie's already presented? Joe? No. Okay, so no questions on what you've given us so far. So then I guess let's touch on a couple other sort of what if situations. Anybody got any? If not, I'll start out with one.
I have one, but you want
go
to
ahead.
go first. Carol, what I was considering is, could development rights along the parcel be considered a necessity? Do you know if there's any case law on that? Because one of the problems we have in Traverse City is we have really busy roads that there's zillions of accesses along the driveway, along the roadways. And if the road commission in previous times had been able to, or had considered it necessary to limit the access by buying the development rights along the road, could we consider that as part of the necessity to alleviate future problems with the roadways being overrun?
So, okay, you're saying that there are current parcels that have too many access points into the road. Could we acquire some of those access points?
If we acquire things in the future, not going backwards, you were talking a little bit about necessity. And I was wondering if we could say that to keep the same thing from happening again, if that was if we could demonstrate that might be a necessity.
Well, I mean, on a go-forward basis, we can establish through our right-of-way rules and regulations, we can limit the number of accesses that a particular piece of property can have, as long as we have a rational basis and a reasonable basis to do that. We can do that. And if we're not taking away something that they already have through our rule and regulation, that's totally a legitimate something for us to do that we wouldn't have to compensate for. The issue may come where we're taking away what they already have. If we're taking away something that they already have, a property owner may, without a rational basis or without a triggering point, the property owner may have a claim that we should pay them for that. Maybe. It would depend very much on the situation.
I was thinking about combining drives along major thoroughfares.
Yeah, and we are actually working with townships to put that into their developmental specs too, because it's a lot easier to do it with the planning stage than even with us. But yes, that's something we need to do. We need to have better access management.
Yeah.
And a lot of that I think is being handled now with the township through zoning and planning. So, but it needs more work, and we can all see a lot of places in the county where that was not well done in the past.
I wasn't pointing fingers either.
No, I mean, just a fact.
It just happens what happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Anybody have any sort of general questions or specific ideas or questions?
Yes, when we're looking at environmental issues, that's really where we're going to be fighting the necessity argument. We're not going to be fighting for purchase the property necessarily, but I suspect we're going to run into some of those environmental trade-offs. What's the value of that?
Well, and just, because we've been going through the East-West and we're talking about the potential of putting in a bridge, the federal government is going to be the one who approves the path of said bridge if it is in fact put in place. At which point, the necessity to avoid these very sensitive environmental areas could be clearly spelled out. And I would hope at least that a circuit court action would take into account the fact that NEPA said this is where the bridge has to be.
Yeah, and just so you guys know, I don't know if I was clear about this. So then in the necessity challenge, the issue of whether the project, whether the project is needed, like your example there, whether we should be putting in a east-west corridor through a particular area, or whether we should even be constructing it, right? That's not an issue for the court to consider in that necessity challenge. As long as, it's really within the discretion of the public body to decide, well, here's a project we need to do. And no one's going to question the need to do the project or the determination of the need to do the project, as long as it's reasonable. I mean, as long as it's rational and reasonable, and you guys have all the discretion, as long as it's not arbitrary and capricious. So
necessity is a local thing.
In other words, we decide what is necessary.
You decide if it's necessary to do a project,
And,
but the
and
necessity challenge is do you need this particular piece of property, or do you need all of this particular piece of property or whatever in order to do the project that you've decided to do that no one's going to question unless it's arbitrary and capricious. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It's not going to be that they're not going to question your decision to do the project. I mean, there might be other like avenues, but it's not through the acquisition process. They're not going to, that's not going to be an issue. It's going to be the question of whether you need, like if we say, oh yeah, we're going to acquire this 40 acre piece of parcel to do a road, to put a 66-foot road through, right? That's where you could maybe challenge, like, do you really need 40 acres to put a 66-foot wide road through? Or could you just do it with an easement, for example?
I think Joe says he's got a follow
Well,
up.
it's kind of along the next line. If we're having to go through a wetland and we have to mediate the wetland, we can use this. I can think of a particular project the state did where we went out and bought land and created a wetland to go through a wetland. Is this also included in purchase of land, or is that something
Well,
totally different?
we fortunately have a wetland bank already.
So we have a manager.
We manage it.
Right.
Bank the whole rate we have now.
But for building the road itself, we had to go
That's
through
good.
it.
We don't acquire another property, another way.
I've got something on our,
Because we literally went out and bought land on a state level.
Yeah.
That road.
I mean, a little more practical, I guess, what if sort of situation is, as you know, we've got a roundabout, we're gonna build a cast and keystone. There was a house there.
Mhm.
It's on the schedule. We've got it budgeted for next year. So it's pretty quick. We had to buy the house. We're gonna do it next year. So we bought it and now we're gonna try to move it and recoup some of our money. What if, say, we've got a roundabout that's not scheduled to be done for 5 years? And there's a similar situation there. There's a house that we have to acquire in order to build that roundabout. Is there any looking forward time frame? I mean, can we now approach that 5 year down the road homeowner and say, hey, we'll buy your house. We don't need it for 5 years. How much latitude do we have to negotiate with them to say, you make us a better price now and we'll rent it back to you dirt cheap or for free as a part of consideration? How much latitude do we have to deal on something on that basis?
Well, if we don't need it now, if we need it in 5 years, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could approach them and just, let's say that we're interested in purchasing your property. Depending on the source of funding, right? Like if we're just using our money.
Let's say we're using our money.
Yeah, we're just using our money. There's no real rules. I mean, there's no other rules that we have to deal with. Yeah, I mean, we can approach them and say, hey, yeah, we're interested, and we'd be happy to because we can't rent it to them for free because that would be like giving something away to them. So there's a way that you can work the numbers. So we're not giving them anything, but it works, it helps them. It would be depending on the numbers. So we'd be renting it instead of them paying us, we would pay less for the property. We'd pay less, and then the difference would be made up in the rent. That's the way we could do that.
All right, or if another one, I mean, say they say, well, I don't want to do that. Give me the money. I'm going to move out now. Now I got a vacant house sitting there. So we've either got to decide, okay, we're going to wait 3 or 4 years to whoever might own it and renegotiate, or can we buy it and then hire a property manager to rent it out for us?
Yep.
Can we own and rent property out like a private developer property owner?
Yes, and we have done it. I mean, we've had some rental properties.
Okay. And it seems like to me, just looking at this, as far as if it's a principal residence, it can go up to 125%. But if it's not, then you can you're set with the appraised value. So it would almost be favorable to us if we announced that we're going to build a new road through a certain area and developers came in, speculators, and bought up the property, and now we can exercise eminent domain at 100% instead of 125. Is that?
Well, yes, although I mean, you would want to, I mean, yes, it's possible. It can be done. you would just want to be really careful, because, depending on the ultimate source of funds, because you can't use coercive tactics. So you just would want to make sure that like that you stayed in the realm of like reasonableness in that regard.
Okay, and then sort of another question too. I mean, in East-West mobility study, we're going to come up with a path. There's like 5 different things, and eventually we're going to say, okay, we're going to put a crossing here, and we're going to connect roads on each end to here to here. We're going to have, it's going to go from here to here, and it requires new roads. I mean, we have to be open about that. But at what point do we have to do that to where we're opening the door to real estate speculators? You know, I mean, it seems like there's a thing there. You don't want to show them your hand, but
Yeah.
you can also keep it too much of a secret. At what point, what do we have to make public that may or may not make it more difficult for us in the future, or more expensive to acquire the property? And that's probably a long answer.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, it's definitely it is something to keep in mind when thinking about what, if that is a concern, that what and when to release the information regarding that, because you don't want somebody to buy the property thinking that they're going to make a lot of money off the road commission having to buy it in the future. Because what happens when you have those speculations, and I've seen it happen where, like, if somebody thinks, oh yeah, I'm going to make big bank because the road commission is going to come in and buy this because they have to, that's when they become very unreasonable, and you're going to end up in condemnation. You're going to end up in court because they won't understand, and they won't understand that you can't ultimately pay anything more than fair market value. And then when you're thinking about fair market value, I mean, you're not thinking about like what it'll be like after we put in our road, like what is the value after we put in the road?
It is now.
It's what is the value now, exactly.
Let me put a couple of things together that you just went over, and then add something here. Okay, so we're looking 5 years down the road. Let's just say we're looking 5 years down the road. We know we're going to have a piece of property, a home, for example, like Bill suggested. All right, let's say that we know for a fact, or that in the past historically we've been able to get 50% of our costs recovered for those purchases. Now, if we use our money to buy it now, and then 5 years down the road we do this project, can we recoup that cost later on? And the reason we want to buy it now is if 50%, well, hey, look, we look at our markets, and our markets go crazy from time to time, and 100,000 this year is a $300,000 house next year. So is that something, can we recover down the road those costs if it's been identified as a purchase for that particular project, for example?
Well, if it's a grant funds, typically you can't like do anything towards the project that you get reimbursed for until you're awarded the grant. But I mean, it would depend on what the grant says. Sometimes there's a little wiggle room in there, but usually the grant will only reimburse things that happen after you're awarded the grant. So that would be the problem for that. And then the federal transportation funds, I'm not sure, like if it's not a grant, it's just the federal transportation funds, if they would reimburse you for and my guess is they probably have the same rules, but I'd have to look on that.
Okay. Well, we're getting right up close to 7 o'clock here when our other meeting starts. Maybe we should have put more than an hour for this, but I guess why we leave this, that if there's any questions come up, I guess write them out, type them up, and then we'll forward them, to Carrie to give us back responses to it. And if we need to follow up with another what if, whereas kind of thing. But it looks like, Carrie's billable hours are going to be pretty good this next year, maybe. Go ahead.
I mean, feel free if you guys think of questions. I mean, I mean, we can just do quick answers, and then if it gets like so much, let's just do another session. I have no problem with that. Okay.
I think there's going to be some other questions. Some of these will be easy. Some of them are going to be a little more difficult,
Right.
Depending on what we're looking at. And it seems like we as we move forward with the East-West thing, it'll become more clear exactly what our challenge is going to be once we have a little more specificity on where the heck it's going to go.
Mhm.
if at all.
Yeah, and I know it's almost 7, but I mean, I know, I did think about that one issue you raised for, Bill, and maybe I'll just do a quick email on that, because you thought, you asked me a good question that I've thought about, and so I'll do a quick email on that that can be shared.
And we'll share it with everybody and be part of the public record.
Yeah, okay, great.
All right, very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, guys.
Okay,
Thank you.
that takes us to our second public comment.
Is it just the same three?
No, we have a couple more, but it's not public. It's guys from the office. Jay, Joe, and.
Okay.
So we don't need it.
Okay, we have no public on the Zoom. Okay. Managers' comments.
Nothing on this one. We'll pick them up at the end.
Okay, commissioner comments.
Next one.
Okay, we'll pick those up in the next. And I guess that would put us at adjournment.
Support.
And we are adjourned.